You really think that old thing can still hit anything? The laughter rolled across echo range before the words had even finished echoing against the distant hills. It was the kind of laughter born from confidence, sharpened by youth, and carried by Marines who believed every answer could be found inside the newest equipment resting neatly on the firing benches before them. The late morning sun shimmered above the desert, turning the distant ridgelines into waves of silver heat, while a steady breeze swept thin ribbons of dust across the firing lanes. Steel silhouettes waited between 1,200 and 1,600 yards away, barely visible against the rocky terrain. Digital weather stations blinked quietly beside expensive spotting scopes. Ballistic computers displayed precise calculations. Carbon fiber rifles rested on bipods like polished machines built for perfection. Then an old pickup truck pulled into the gravel parking area without attracting much attention. The engine clicked softly as it cooled beneath the relentless Arizona sun. A man climbed out with deliberate movements that seemed almost too calm for the busy military range surrounding him. Thomas Walker was 82 years old. His faded denim jacket fluttered gently in the dry wind, and a weathered baseball cap shaded pale blue eyes that appeared to notice everything without searching for anything. Resting across his shoulder was a worn rifle wrapped inside an old canvas sleeve whose faded green fabric had long ago surrendered to decades of dust and sunlight. He walked toward the firing line without hurry, every step steady, every movement economical, as though time itself had stopped trying to rush him many years earlier. Sergeant Ethan Brooks noticed him almost immediately. He was 28, broad-shouldered, proud of graduating near the top of every advanced marksmanship course he had attended, and surrounded by younger Marines who admired both his confidence and his sharp tongue. Brooks watched the old man lay the canvas sleeve across an empty bench before slowly unfastening its weathered leather straps. The rifle inside looked painfully out of place among the sleek precision weapons. Nearby, its walnut stock carried faded orange paint worn thin by countless careful hands. Small cracks traced along the wood near the grip. The steel showed honest age rather than polished beauty. Even the scope looked like something rescued from another lifetime. Brooks stared for a heartbeat before a grin spread across his face. No way. He laughed loudly enough for half the range to hear. Did somebody bring a museum exhibit to qualification day? Several Marines looked over their shoulders. One stepped closer, squinting at the rifle before shaking his head. That thing looks broken. Another chuckled. I think my grandfather retired something newer than that. More laughter followed. Thomas neither smiled nor frowned. He rested one weathered hand gently against the rifle, as if greeting an old friend after a long journey. His fingertips brushed lightly across the scarred wood before he quietly lifted his eyes toward the distant mountains instead of the men surrounding him. Brooks mistook the silence for surrender. Sir, he called, folding his arms with theatrical patience. This is a Marine precision range. Those targets are over a mile away. We're training with real equipment today. A fresh wave of laughter swept through the firing line. Nearby, Lance Corporal Ryan Cole lowered his spotting scope. Unlike the others, he found himself watching the old man's eyes instead of the rifle. They were not wandering across the landscape. They were measuring something invisible. The shifting mirage, the drifting dust, the restless flags standing hundreds of yards apart. Thomas said nothing. He simply looked into the wind with the quiet attention of someone listening to a conversation no one else could hear. Ryan felt an uneasy curiosity settle into the back of his mind. Around him, everyone saw an old veteran carrying a broken rifle. Somehow, Ryan could not shake the feeling they were laughing at the wrong thing. Sergeant Ethan Brooks rested both hands on the shooting bench, enjoying the attention that naturally gathered whenever he turned another ordinary moment into entertainment. Tell you what, he said with a confident grin. We will make this simple. If that rifle can still hit steel at 1,600 yards, I will personally apologize in front of every Marine standing here. But if it cannot, you pack it up and head home. Several young Marines laughed in approval while others reached for their phones, careful to remain outside restricted recording areas, but eager to remember what they expected would become another funny story shared back at the barracks. Thomas Walker looked at Brooks for several quiet seconds before lowering his eyes to the old rifle resting on the bench. He slowly ran the back of two weathered fingers across the faded orange stock, stopping where a long crack stretched beneath the worn finish. His touch was so gentle that it almost looked like he was brushing dust from an old family photograph rather than examining a rifle. Brooks noticed the movement and stepped closer. "That crack is not helping your chances," he said with a smirk. "Honestly, I am surprised the armory even let something like that exist." More laughter rippled across the firing line. One Marine leaned over for a closer look. "Look at the scope," he joked. "I have seen better glass at antique stores." Another pointed toward the faded finish. "Did somebody paint it with leftover traffic paint?" Thomas remained perfectly still. The breeze carried the faint smell of dry earth and burned powder across the range, while distant steel targets shimmered beneath layers of rising heat. He finally answered in a calm voice that barely rose above the wind. "She has seen worse days than this." Brooks chuckled. "You gave your rifle a name?" Thomas nodded once. "No, only respect." The simple reply drew another round of amused smiles from the younger Marines, but Lance Corporal Ryan Cole did not laugh this time. His attention remained fixed on Thomas instead of the rifle. During every advanced marksmanship course Ryan had attended, instructors constantly reminded students to observe everything before taking a shot. Yet the old veteran had barely looked at the target frames. Instead, his eyes kept drifting toward the distant hills, the fluttering range flags, and the shimmering waves dancing above the rocky ground. It was almost as though he was studying something invisible that every electronic weather station nearby had somehow failed to notice. Brooks reached toward the rifle without asking permission and lightly tapped one finger against the cracked stock. "You really trust this thing?" he asked. Thomas gently lifted the rifle before Brooks could touch it again. There was no anger in the movement, only quiet certainty. "More than most people trust themselves," he answered. The words settled into the warm afternoon air with unexpected weight. Ryan felt something shift inside him. Confidence usually sounded loud. Real experience rarely did. Around them, expensive ballistic computers continued calculating wind values while digital displays flashed changing numbers every few seconds. One Marine proudly adjusted his electronic weather meter and announced a steady crosswind from the left. Thomas glanced toward a narrow valley nearly half a mile beyond the nearest target before looking briefly at the scattered dust rolling across the ground. "Not all the way," he murmured almost to himself. Brooks folded his arms again. "The computers disagree." Thomas simply smiled, neither challenging nor correcting him. He looked toward a weathered cottonwood standing alone beyond the final firing lane. One branch swayed gently in the opposite direction from the nearest range flag. Ryan followed the old man's gaze and noticed it too. His pulse quickened. Without drawing attention, he quietly stepped away from the firing line, reached into his pocket, and pulled out his phone. There was one retired Marine gunnery sergeant assigned to the range headquarters who had spent 3 decades teaching long-range shooting. Ryan suddenly felt an overwhelming need to ask him a single question. "Have you ever heard of a man named Thomas Walker?" Ryan Cole stepped beyond the firing benches until the laughter behind him softened beneath the steady whisper of the desert wind. He glanced once over his shoulder before pressing the call button. The line connected almost immediately. "Range headquarters," an older voice answered. "Master Sergeant Daniel Hayes speaking." Ryan lowered his voice. "Master Sergeant, I need to ask you something." "That probably sounds strange." A brief silence followed. "Go ahead." Ryan looked back toward the firing line where Thomas Walker stood quietly beside the weathered rifle while Sergeant Ethan Brooks continued entertaining the growing crowd. "Have you ever heard of a retired Marine named Thomas Walker?" Nothing came through the phone for nearly 3 full seconds. Ryan frowned and checked the screen to make sure the call had not dropped. Then Daniel Hayes finally spoke, but the calm confidence normally heard in his voice had disappeared. "Describe him." Ryan swallowed. "About 80 years old. Gray hair, faded denim jacket, old orange rifle with a cracked walnut stock." Another pause. This one felt even longer. Ryan heard papers moving across a desk before Hayes asked another question. "Is the crack near the pistol grip?" Ryan stared toward the rifle. "Yes, sir." "Does the stock have what looks like an old piece of metal buried under the finish?" Ryan narrowed his eyes. From where he stood, he could barely make out a tiny dark mark inside the worn wood. "I think so." Hayes exhaled slowly. "Stay where you are. Do not let anyone damage that rifle." Ryan blinked in confusion. "Sir, just answer me honestly. Has anyone handled it?" Ryan hesitated. Sergeant Brooks tapped the stock a few minutes ago. Hayes did not reply immediately. When he finally spoke, every word carried unusual weight. Listen carefully, Lance Corporal. That rifle is not important because it is old. It is important because of who carried it. I need you to keep your eyes on Mr. Walker. I am making another call. Before Ryan could ask another question, the line went silent. He slowly lowered the phone, uncertainty replacing every assumption he had formed that morning. Back at the firing line, Brooks had become even more confident as additional Marines wandered over from nearby qualification lanes to see what all the commotion was about. Someone placed a folding chair beside the shooting bench with exaggerated politeness. Might as well be comfortable before this history lesson, one Marine joked. More laughter followed. Thomas thanked him with a small nod, but remained standing. He rested the rifle across the bench instead of taking position behind it. His attention drifted once more toward the distant valley where sunlight shimmered above layers of heated rock. The nearest electronic weather station beeped softly as fresh wind data appeared across its screen. Brooks lifted the display so everyone nearby could see it. 3 miles per hour from the left, he announced proudly. Nice and simple. Thomas quietly shook his head. Only here. Brooks smiled with patient amusement. The computer measures the entire lane. Thomas looked toward the horizon again. No, it measures where it stands. Several Marines exchanged puzzled glances before dismissing the remark with quiet chuckles. Ryan did not laugh. His eyes followed the invisible path Thomas seemed to study. The closest range flag leaned gently left. A second flag nearly 800 yards farther downrange fluttered in the opposite direction. Beyond that, nothing moved except faint ribbons of shimmering heat rising from the rocks. Ryan suddenly realized he had never actually looked that carefully before. Somewhere inside headquarters, Daniel Hayes reached for another phone. He no longer intended to call the range office. Instead, he searched an old contact list that very few people on the base even knew existed. When he found the number, he dialed without hesitation. As the call connected, he spoke only one sentence. Sir, I believe Thomas Walker has just walked onto Echo Range. Thomas Walker reached for the old rifle with both hands, lifting it from the bench so carefully that the laughter around him slowly faded into curious silence. His thumbs settled naturally against the long crack running through the faded orange stock. The rough wood felt warm beneath his weathered skin, polished smooth by thousands of hours carried across mountains, deserts, forests, and lonely firing positions long forgotten by history. His breathing slowed almost imperceptibly. The dry Arizona air disappeared. The smell of sun-baked dust dissolved into the damp scent of rain-soaked earth and crushed jungle leaves. The sharp metallic clicks of modern rifles faded beneath the distant rhythm of helicopters somewhere beyond a thick green canopy. For one quiet heartbeat, Thomas was no longer an elderly Marine standing beneath a cloudless American sky. He was a young man lying motionless on a rain-covered hillside, listening more than looking. Wind drifted through towering trees in uneven layers, carrying whispers that could not be measured by instruments. A young lieutenant rested only a few feet away, studying the same valley through binoculars before lowering them with quiet frustration. I cannot figure out these winds, the lieutenant admitted. Thomas never lifted his eyes from the distant ridgeline. Because they are not one wind, he answered softly. They are three. The younger officer frowned before following Thomas's finger toward the treetops. High branches leaned gently toward the east. Mid-level leaves barely moved at all. Far below, drifting mist slipped steadily toward the west. 3 invisible currents occupied the same valley without ever touching one another. The lieutenant stared for several long seconds before a slow smile crossed his face. How did you see that? Thomas shrugged almost shyly. The bird stopped flying through the middle. The memory shifted. Hours later, the same young lieutenant carefully removed a tiny fragment of dull metal from his own field pack. It was nothing more than a smooth piece of steel shaped by accident rather than design. He pressed it into Thomas's hand. Keep it, he said quietly. Equipment wears out. Wood cracks. Metal rusts. What matters is the Marine who learns to notice what everyone else misses. Thomas looked down at the little piece of metal before carefully pressing it into a narrow opening beneath the rifle's cracked stock. The repair was simple, almost invisible, but from that day forward the tiny fragment remained hidden inside the wood, not strengthening the rifle nearly as much as reminding its owner of a lesson that could never be written inside any manual. The jungle slowly dissolved. Warm desert sunlight returned. The distant hills of Echo Range shimmered once again beneath rising waves of heat. Thomas blinked only once before gently adjusting his grip on the rifle. Around him, the Marines saw nothing unusual. To them, the old veteran had merely paused for a moment while examining a worn firearm. Sergeant Ethan Brooks glanced impatiently toward his watch. "Everything all right?" he asked with another confident smile. "We have got the whole afternoon if you need it." A few chuckles followed, though they sounded weaker than before. Thomas looked toward the distant targets without answering immediately. His pale blue eyes moved beyond the steel silhouettes, beyond the fluttering flags, beyond the electronic weather stations that continued flashing neat rows of changing numbers. He watched a lone hawk circling high above the valley before it suddenly shifted its wings and drifted farther south without a single flap. A faint smile appeared across his face. "Still listening," he murmured. Ryan Cole heard the words even though no one else seemed to. At that exact moment, hundreds of yards away inside the administration building, Daniel Hayes remained standing beside his desk with the telephone pressed firmly against his ear. The voice answering on the other end had become unusually quiet after hearing one name. Hayes listened respectfully before responding with only 3 words. "Yes, sir." Confirmed. He lowered the receiver slowly, turned toward the parking area outside headquarters, and watched as a black government vehicle began pulling away from the building with calm, deliberate purpose. The warm breeze drifted steadily across Echo Range, carrying the dry scent of sagebrush and sun-baked earth, while the rows of electronic weather stations continued updating their numbers every few seconds. Sergeant Ethan Brooks folded his arms with growing confidence, convinced the old Marine was delaying the inevitable. "If you are waiting for the wind to disappear," he called with an amused smile, "you might be here until tomorrow." A few quiet laughs answered him, although the easy humor that had filled the range earlier was beginning to fade beneath simple curiosity. Thomas Walker remained focused on the valley stretching beyond the steel targets. He slowly raised one hand, not toward the rifle but toward the distant landscape itself. His finger traced an invisible path through the air before settling toward a narrow ravine nearly 1,000 yards away. "The first wind is honest," he said calmly. "It tells everyone where it is going." He shifted his hand slightly higher toward a shimmering band of heat floating above the rocks. "The second wind hides inside the heat." Finally, he pointed toward the distant ridgeline where a lone hawk continued circling without effort. "The third one belongs to the mountain." Brooks glanced toward the digital display mounted beside the firing position and shook his head with theatrical patience. "The weather station says 3 miles per hour from the left." Thomas smiled faintly. "It is correct." Brooks spread his hands triumphantly toward the watching Marines. "Finally, we agree." Thomas looked at him with quiet kindness before finishing the thought. "It is correct where the weather station is standing." The words settled over the firing line more heavily than anyone expected. Several Marines instinctively looked from the electronic display toward the distant valley, then back again. Ryan Cole slowly lifted his spotting scope and aimed not at the steel target, but toward the ridgeline Thomas had been studying since arriving. The shimmering air distorted everything beyond 800 yards, yet through brief openings in the heat, he noticed something unusual. Thin ribbons of dust drifting along the valley floor moved steadily from left to right. Higher above the rocks, scattered leaves fluttered in the opposite direction. Even farther beyond, the lone hawk suddenly banked without flapping its wings and glided toward the southeast, as though riding another invisible current altogether. Ryan lowered the scope with widening eyes. He quietly adjusted it again, hoping he had imagined the difference. He had not. Brooks noticed Ryan's expression and laughed. "Do not tell me he has convinced you too." Ryan hesitated. "Sir, I think there really are different wind layers." Brooks shook his head. "Heat distortion plays tricks on your eyes." Thomas gently rested the rifle across the bench, but still made no effort to shoulder it. "Eyes can be fooled," he agreed. "That is why you learn to watch what the wind moves, instead of watching the wind itself." Nearby conversations slowly faded. Even Marines who had arrived expecting little more than entertainment now found themselves listening. The old veteran never sounded defensive. He never argued. He simply described the landscape as though introducing old friends whose habits he had learned long ago. Hundreds of yards away, the black government vehicle rolled quietly through the main gate and accelerated toward Echo Range without lights or sirens. Inside the front seat, Major General Robert Callahan listened without interrupting as Daniel Hayes summarized everything he had witnessed. When Hayes finished, the general remained silent for several moments before asking only one question. "Has Mr. Walker fired a shot yet?" "No, sir," Hayes replied. "He has only been reading the wind." The general looked through the windshield toward the distant mountains slowly rising above the desert horizon. "Good," he answered softly. "Then perhaps they still have time to learn what the rifle was never meant to teach them." Echo Range had grown strangely quiet. The easy laughter that had echoed across the firing line less than 20 minutes earlier had given way to something far more uncomfortable. Nobody wanted to admit it aloud, but the old Marine standing beside the weathered rifle no longer looked like an amusing visitor who had wandered into the wrong place. He looked like a man who belonged exactly where he was. Sergeant Ethan Brooks refused to let the silence shift the balance. He straightened his shoulders and forced another confident smile. "All right," he announced. "Enough theory. We have heard about invisible winds, mountains, birds, and heat. Out here, only one thing matters." He pointed toward the steel silhouette resting nearly 1,600 yards away. "Can you hit that target or not?" Every pair of eyes turned toward Thomas Walker. The old veteran rested one hand lightly on the rifle without lifting it. His expression remained calm, almost thoughtful, as another gentle breeze rolled across the range carrying the dry scent of sagebrush and warm stone. "Not yet," he answered quietly. Brooks laughed again, relieved to hear what sounded like hesitation. "Still waiting for the perfect conditions?" Thomas slowly shook his head. "There are no perfect conditions." Brooks spread his hands toward the waiting Marines. "Then what exactly are you waiting for?" Thomas looked beyond the steel target toward the distant ridgeline where sunlight shimmered across uneven bands of rising heat. "For the valley to finish changing its mind." Several Marines exchanged puzzled looks. Ryan Cole instinctively lifted his spotting scope again. This time he ignored the target completely. Instead, he followed the invisible route Thomas had been studying since arriving. The nearest flag still leaned gently toward the right. Farther downrange, scattered dust drifted left. High above the canyon, the hawk Thomas had quietly watched all afternoon folded its wings, circled once, and suddenly climbed without flapping. Ryan slowly lowered the scope. The pattern had changed again. Before he could speak, the distant hum of approaching engines drifted across the installation. At first, nobody paid attention. Government vehicles moved around the base every day. But this convoy sounded different. Smooth. Disciplined, deliberate. Marines standing near the access road turned their heads almost together as two black sport utility vehicles appeared beyond the maintenance buildings, followed by a military police escort maintaining perfect spacing without using emergency lights. Brooks glanced toward the road before dismissing it with a shrug. Probably another command inspection. Thomas did not even look in that direction. He remained focused on the valley. Ryan noticed that detail immediately. Most civilians would have watched the arriving convoy out of curiosity. Thomas acted as though he already understood something far more important than who happened to be driving across the base. Hundreds of yards away, the lead vehicle slowed before reaching the entrance to Echo Range. Inside, Major General Robert Callahan looked through the windshield without speaking. Daniel Hayes sat beside him, watching the firing line through narrowed eyes. "Has anyone recognized him?" the general asked. Hayes shook his head. "Not yet, sir. They only know he carries an old rifle." The general gave a faint nod. "Good." Hayes looked at him with quiet surprise. "Sir, respect discovered too early teaches very little," Callahan answered softly. "Sometimes people need enough time to reveal who they are before they understand who someone else has been." Back on the firing line, Brooks checked his watch with exaggerated impatience. "Last chance," he called. "Either take the shot or admit that rifle belongs in a display case." Thomas finally wrapped both hands around the weathered stock and gently lifted the rifle from the bench. The movement was slow, unhurried, and so naturally practiced that it seemed less like preparation than memory returning to familiar hands. Around him, conversation stopped without anyone asking for silence. Even the breeze seemed softer as every Marine watched the old veteran settle the rifle comfortably against his shoulder. No one noticed the convoy quietly stopping beyond the range entrance. No one noticed several senior officers stepping from the vehicles. At that moment, every eye remained fixed on one elderly Marine who had still not fired a single round. Thomas Walker settled the worn rifle against his shoulder with the quiet confidence of a man greeting an old companion rather than handling a piece of equipment. His cheek rested naturally against the faded stock. His breathing slowed until it blended almost perfectly with the whisper of the desert wind. Around him, every Marine remained motionless. Sergeant Ethan Brooks folded his arms, determined not to let the growing silence shake his confidence. "Whenever you are ready," he said, forcing another smile. Thomas never answered. His pale blue eyes remained fixed far beyond the steel silhouette waiting 1,600 yards away. He was not staring at the target. He was studying everything between himself and the target. The nearest range flag fluttered once before relaxing. A shimmer of heat drifted upward from a rocky shelf nearly halfway downrange. The lone hawk that had circled the valley all afternoon suddenly banked north before disappearing beyond the ridgeline. Thomas watched each tiny change with patient attention. Ryan Cole quietly lifted his spotting scope one more time. This time he understood what he had been missing. The old Marine had never been searching for a perfect shot. He had been waiting for separate pieces of the landscape to briefly agree with one another. Seconds passed. The valley breathed. Heat shifted. Dust rolled gently across the canyon floor before settling. Thomas exhaled slowly. "There you are," he whispered so softly that only Ryan, standing closest beside him, heard the words. Thomas carefully adjusted the rifle no more than the width of a thumbnail. One weathered finger rested against the trigger without urgency. Every movement carried the effortless precision that comes only from decades of repetition. Brooks glanced toward another Marine and quietly shrugged, as though expecting nothing remarkable to happen. Then the silence broke. A single report echoed across the open desert, crisp and clean before rolling toward the distant mountains in fading waves. The rifle barely moved against Thomas's shoulder. He continued looking through the old scope for another heartbeat before gently lowering the muzzle. No celebration crossed his face. No dramatic gesture followed. He simply stood quietly with the rifle resting comfortably in his hands. Nearly 2 seconds later, a sharp metallic ring floated back across the valley. The distant steel silhouette swung visibly beneath the afternoon sun. Nobody spoke. Several Marines instinctively looked toward one another, convinced they had somehow misunderstood what they had just witnessed. Ryan kept his eye behind the spotting scope, following the slowly swaying target. The impact set almost perfectly at center mass. His mouth opened slightly before he lowered the scope in stunned disbelief. Brooks stepped forward and grabbed the high-powered spotting optic from the bench. He looked through it himself. The target continued rocking gently in the distance, sunlight flashing across fresh gray steel where the round had landed. Brooks blinked once. Then again. He slowly lowered the optic without saying a word. Around the firing line, conversations vanished completely. Even the Marines who had laughed the loudest moments earlier now stood perfectly still. Behind them, unnoticed until now, the rear passenger door of the lead black vehicle opened quietly. Major General Robert Callahan stepped onto the pavement wearing a neatly pressed service uniform that caught the afternoon light. Daniel Hayes followed one pace behind. Neither man spoke. Neither hurried. The general looked across the silent firing line toward Thomas Walker, who still rested the old rifle comfortably against one shoulder as though nothing extraordinary had happened. A faint smile appeared on the general's face, not because of the shot itself, but because he recognized the patient discipline behind it. Without waiting for anyone to announce his arrival, Major General Callahan began walking calmly toward the elderly Marine, while every step drew closer to a moment that would change the atmosphere of Echo Range far more than the sound of a single perfectly placed round ever could. The silence lingered long after the distant steel target stopped moving. It was not the silence of confusion anymore. It was the silence that arrived when certainty quietly collapsed beneath undeniable evidence. Sergeant Ethan Brooks continued staring through the spotting scope as though another look might somehow change what he had already seen. It did not. The clean impact remained exactly where it had landed. He slowly lowered the optic, his confident expression replaced by something far less familiar. Uncertainty. Around him, Marines who had spent the afternoon laughing now stood shoulder to shoulder without speaking. Even the steady clicking of digital weather stations seemed strangely distant beneath the weight of the moment. Thomas Walker calmly opened the rifle's bolt and rested the old firearm across his shoulder again. His breathing never changed. His expression remained peaceful. It was simply another afternoon beneath an open sky. He turned slightly, preparing to place the rifle back inside its worn canvas sleeve, when quiet footsteps approached across the gravel. Ryan Cole noticed the movement first. His eyes widened as he instinctively straightened his posture. Daniel Hayes walked several steps ahead before stopping, respectfully to one side. Behind him, Major General Robert Callahan continued forward alone. The four-star general did not hurry. Every measured step carried the calm confidence of a man who understood exactly why he had come. Brooks finally looked away from the spotting scope and froze. Every Marine within sight instinctively snapped to attention. The sudden movement echoed across the firing line as boots settled against packed earth in perfect discipline. Yet the general did not acknowledge any of them. His eyes never left Thomas Walker. The elderly Marine quietly turned after hearing the familiar rhythm of approaching footsteps. For a brief moment, two old soldiers simply looked at one another beneath the bright afternoon sun. Then a warm smile crossed Thomas's weathered face. "Robert," he said softly. The general smiled in return. "Good afternoon, Tom." No rank, no ceremony, just two men greeting each other after many years. Brooks felt his heartbeat quicken. Very few people addressed a four-star general by his first name. Even fewer received that same quiet familiarity in return. General Callahan stopped only a few feet away and looked toward the faded rifle resting comfortably against Thomas's shoulder. His eyes settled briefly on the cracked orange stock before another gentle smile appeared. "You still carry her?" Thomas nodded. "She still carries me." The general chuckled softly. "I was hoping that answer had not changed." Daniel Hayes lowered his eyes with unmistakable respect. Ryan watched the exchange in complete disbelief. Nothing about this conversation sounded rehearsed. It sounded like years of shared history compressed into only a few quiet sentences. General Callahan slowly turned toward the assembled Marines. "How many of you noticed the wind?" No one answered. "How many of you noticed the hawk?" Silence again. "How many of you noticed the dust crossing the valley in 3 different directions?" Brooks lowered his eyes. The general nodded gently, not with disappointment, but understanding. Mr. Walker was reading every one of them long before anyone asked him to touch that rifle. He looked back toward Thomas. "You taught us that a marksman never fights the wind. He learns its language." Thomas smiled faintly without saying a word. Callahan rested one hand lightly against the worn stock, careful not to cover the long crack running through the old walnut. "Many years ago," he said quietly to the watching Marines, "this rifle helped teach lessons that still shape how generations of Marine instructors think about observation, patience, and judgment. Not because of the wood, not because of the steel, because of the Marines standing beside it." No one laughed now. No one even shifted their weight. Every eye remained fixed upon the quiet veteran they had mistaken for an old man, carrying nothing more than an outdated rifle. For several long moments, nobody spoke. The desert breeze continued moving quietly across Echo Range, carrying the faint scent of warm stone and dry sage, while sunlight reflected softly from rows of polished rifles resting untouched on the firing benches. The silence no longer belonged to surprise. It belonged to reflection. Sergeant Ethan Brooks slowly stepped forward until he stood only a few feet from Thomas Walker. The confidence that had carried him through the afternoon had disappeared somewhere between the sound of the distant steel target and the arrival of the general. He removed his gloves carefully before extending one hand toward the old Marine. "Sir," he said, his voice steady but quieter than anyone had heard before, "I judged your rifle before I understood the man carrying it. I should not have done that." Thomas looked at the young Marine for a moment before accepting the handshake with a warm, weathered smile. "Every Marine spends part of life learning," he replied gently. "The important part is deciding what lesson stays with you." Brooks nodded silently. No excuses followed. None were needed. Major General Robert Callahan watched the exchange with quiet approval before turning toward the assembled Marines. "You spend thousands of hours mastering equipment," he said calmly. You study ballistics, optics, mathematics, weather, and technology because they matter. They should matter. But none of those tools can replace patience, humility, or observation. Those qualities still belong to people. His eyes settled briefly on the faded rifle resting across Thomas's shoulder. Many of the principles taught in advanced marksmanship programs today were shaped by instructors like Mr. Walker. Most of you have benefited from lessons whose origin you never knew. Ryan Cole lowered his eyes toward the gravel beneath his boots, remembering the old veteran quietly watching a hawk, while everyone else trusted only digital displays. The lesson suddenly felt much larger than long-range shooting. It reached far beyond rifles and targets. Daniel Hayes stepped beside Thomas and carefully handed him the worn canvas rifle sleeve. Thomas slid the old rifle inside with the same deliberate care he had shown when opening it that morning. The cracked walnut stock disappeared beneath faded green canvas, hidden once again from curious eyes. General Callahan smiled. "Would you allow me to give you a ride back to headquarters?" Thomas chuckled softly and pointed toward the weathered pickup truck waiting alone near the parking area. "Thank you, Robert, but that old truck has been bringing me home for 20 years. I would hate to disappoint it now." The general laughed, and several Marines smiled with him. Thomas adjusted the rifle across one shoulder before beginning the slow walk back across the gravel lot. No applause followed. None was necessary. One by one, Marines instinctively stepped aside, creating a quiet path without anyone giving an order. Brooks remained standing at attention until the elderly veteran reached his truck. Ryan watched as Thomas placed the canvas case gently inside the cab before taking one final look toward the distant mountains glowing beneath the afternoon sun. He seemed less interested in the target he had struck than in the wind still moving invisibly through the valley. A moment later, the pickup engine started with a familiar rumble, and the truck rolled slowly toward the exit road before disappearing beyond the low desert hills. Long after the dust had settled, no one returned immediately to training. The electronic weather stations continued displaying perfect numbers. The steel targets waited exactly where they had always stood. Yet every Marine understood that the most important lesson of the day had never appeared on a screen or inside a manual. It had arrived quietly in the hands of an old veteran who never asked anyone to admire his rifle because he had spent a lifetime proving that true precision begins long before a finger ever touches the trigger. Respect is never earned by carrying the newest weapon. It is earned by carrying wisdom so faithfully that even time cannot wear it away.